mentioned, please utilize the chat, the chat icon underneath the presentation so that you can send questions even as the presentations are going on. But most importantly, after every presentation, we shall have at least 5 minutes where we'll have question and answer session. So also feel free to raise your hand and be able to ask your question directly. So thank you so much. As we proceed, this session is divided into various sections. So we shall start with the first presentation, which will be research presentation by Dr. Helena Musao from Kenya. After that presentation, we'll have a short period of question and answer session. And then we'll proceed to a second presentation by Dr. Shalini Mohani from Genentech's approach to supporting health equity through inclusive research. This is from Pharma. And then we'll have also a 5-minute question and answer session, after which we'll have a final presentation by Dr. Funmi Olopade, where we'll be looking at academia, but also bias in research. And after that session as well, we'll have about 5 or so minutes of question and answers. And then we'll go into breakout discussion for about half an hour. Then we come back for a wrap up, where within each breakout discussion, we hope we'll have one person who will summarize very quickly in 1 or 2 minutes what was discussed during that breakout discussion group. And then finally, Ian will close with some closing remarks. And so next, please. So I would like to invite the first presenter. Our main goals for this session is to understand how research is typically funded, and most importantly, to understand the considerations for industry support and avoiding bias. So I'll invite the first presenter who will be making this research presentation. This is going to be Dr. Helena Musao. So Dr. Helena Musao is a consultant clinical oncologist with robust experience in palliative care. She has worked in both private and public sector, as well as managing projects at various levels, and is involved in teaching and health education for both oncology and palliative care. She serves on various technical working groups by the Ministry of Health in Kenya, aiming to improve access to cancer care. She's also involved in a program called Blueprint for Innovative Access to Healthcare, which is currently being conducted in Meru County in Kenya, whose vision is to create an ecosystem for comprehensive cancer control in sub-Saharan Africa, and also aims at improving access to medicines in developing healthcare systems through sustainable partnerships. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Helena Musao. Please go ahead.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Prof. Chite, and thank you to everyone and for the invitation to share with you what my experience is in terms of looking at using drugs, using pharma for clinical research and with already existing drugs. So my introduction, I will go through the introduction and then the rest as was detailed before. So inequities in health research can contribute to inequities in healthcare generally. And what we tend to find is Africa has not quite been on the map when we're looking at conducting clinical research, especially by pharma or looking at clinical trials. We don't have too much experience for non-communicable diseases, but we find that non-communicable diseases are becoming or Africa, sub-Saharan Africa is becoming largely affected by non-communicable diseases. And it's said that probably by the year 2030 that the burden of cancer cases will actually be in sub-Saharan Africa as compared to the Western world. So when we're looking at conducting clinical trials in the region, it's important to assess the oncological medications for this population because we are different, and it's been shown that the genetics of the African population is different, as are the demographic and the lifestyle factors, and also the social factors that we see in this population. But most of the clinical trials we find are not conducted within Africa or do not have a large subset of an African or an Afro population to help guide us in terms of the drugs and the side effects and the unique factors for the sub-Saharan Africa population. Next. So the WHO has got, not the WHO, the federal government has got a website, clinicaltrials.gov, that just details the clinical trials that are being done in the world. And we can see that for Africa, that we are quite underrepresented when we're looking at clinical trials. We actually have about 3% of the clinical trials in the world, and the bulk of these are conducted in Egypt and South Africa. Next. So there is the Pan-African Clinical Trials Registry, which is a regional register of clinical trials in Africa. It was established in 2007 and details clinical trials that are ongoing and also those that are planned for. And looking at them, you can be able to see what sort of trials that are being carried out in Africa. And most of these trials are epidemiological studies, with very few studies having drug interventions. And even when we look at the studies having drug interventions, most of them are for infectious diseases and not necessarily non-communicable diseases. So we still have a long way to go when we're looking at the support for or looking at evidence-based, evidence for clinical trials in Africa with drug interventions. We find that 71% of these trials are being carried out in Egypt and South Africa. So the rest of, Africa still has a long way to go other than those two countries in terms of improving their clinical research skills and awareness so that we can be able to carry out clinical trials. Next. So when I was asked to do this presentation and looking at a case study for clinical research with Pharma, we don't have too much experience in Kenya, which is where I'm from, but we do have some trials going on. But what our main engagement with Pharma comes in the form of drug access programs. So we struggle with the healthcare system, and a lot of the oncological treatments that we find are very exorbitantly priced. And we have Pharma coming in to subsidize some of these prices. So we have either free treatments or we have tiered pricing for low to middle income countries. And so we're able to engage with Pharma on that level. But access to some of the novel drugs or novel agents is becoming quite difficult because of the cost and is limited, even though we have a large population that could benefit from some of these treatments. So we have an opportunity when we're looking at the access programs to be able to deliver some real world efficacy data. The trials done originally for these innovator products were done in a largely in a population that had a very small representation from the African population. So we have a way in which we can give input back to Pharma so that we can be able to get maybe phase 4 trials, or we can give back input in terms of efficacy and even the side effects profiles that might be unique to ourselves. So drug access programs do provide an opportunity for us to be able to engage further with Pharma and look at ways in which we can have some clinical research done in this population. Next. Luckily, with time, we have seen the access or availability of some investigational drugs that may have undergone FDA approval being afforded to low and middle income countries. And this has been through expanded programs, which sometimes are called compassionate programs or compassionate access programs. There's conditions that have to be met for these drugs to be availed to the patients, such that the diagnosis of a serious or a life-threatening illness, that the patient, the client must be unable to participate in a clinical trial, maybe due to geographical factors, or that they are not able to access the center that has the trials going on, or they have no comparable or satisfactory alternative option available to them wherever they are. So the companies allow us, we can engage with Pharma or the industry to be able to access some of these investigational drugs, and there are many pharma companies that do have compassionate programs or access programs, but they also have to assess the risk-benefit profile for that drug and look at the safety and toxicity information. And we also have to provide details regarding the patient care and management and even the side effects profile that these patients go. So this also provides another opportunity for us to be able to engage with pharma when we're looking at doing some data. So we can look at retrospective studies for the patients that we've managed and be able to utilize this to give research, to provide evidence for more programs such as these to be afforded to the African population, and also give some side effects profile, because remember, many times the representation when these drugs are going through the phase 1 or 2 trials were not do not have representation from an African population. So next. So when we're looking at some of the strengths and opportunities that we have within Africa for conducting clinical research, I just looked at my setup and tried to see what it is that we can pull on to be able to advance the agenda of clinical research. And we have improved awareness about the need for research and clinical trials, because we now have standardized ways of treating our patients. So we're looking at the guidelines, we're looking at the evidence, and we're using this to inform the decisions that we make. So we know about clinical trials, we know about the research, we know about the data and the outcomes that these patients have. So we have situations that are unique to us that we can utilize to be able to answer some questions or come up with questions for research in this setup. We have a large, diverse population that is naive to many treatments, such that if we want to engage with pharma, we can be able to utilize this as a way to get some data on the medications, but also to be able for pharma to cut down costs, because they may be able to have a large pool of patients from a small center as compared to having many centers, because we also have a dense population. And there's improved healthcare and expansion of medical institutions. So it's not the case, at least in Kenya, where patients would travel for days to be able to access healthcare. It still happens in some places, but more or less healthcare has improved. Access to healthcare has improved with social insurance coming in to assist with catering to medical costs. There's reduced out-of-pocket costs, and with that, we are seeing increased access to healthcare. So we are seeing more and more patients. So sometimes we can say there is an increase in the number of cancer cases, but it may also be a false increase because of improved access to healthcare. And with improved access to healthcare, then we find that we have situations where patients would need maybe new or novel drugs, and then we can engage pharma to be able to come up with these questions or improve, get access programs to be able to get the treatments. Then reforms to improve research infrastructure. This is a slow process, doesn't happen overnight. And I think most people who want to do research within the region struggle with improving the research infrastructure. But over time, we're seeing some improvements in terms of, we do understand the need for data collection or having robust data and having, different inputs, because if you don't put in data, you will not be able to get much out. So we are improving in terms of our research infrastructure. And then we're also having cross-country and international collaborations. And even within the country, we are having collaborations within different institutions to be able to have multi-center research projects going on. So those are some of the strengths that we see. The weaknesses. Most clinicians do not have dedicated research time and do not have the luxury of just carrying out research alone. Many of them will have to have some clinical duties, and because of reduced number of healthcare professionals, you find that the workload becomes too much, and so research time suffers as a result of that. As I said, the research infrastructure is still wanting. We still don't have as many supplies that we want. We still don't have the processes that we require to be able to do this. The administrative capacity, having clerks or study assistants to be able to come in and assist in collecting some of this data, and statisticians to analyze this data can also pose a challenge. And then poor institution and industry linkages. This is not just with the healthcare facilities, the hospitals, but also even with learning institutions, such that there is still a long way to go in terms of improving the research knowledge amongst healthcare workers across board. So we need to strengthen the institutions, the teaching institutions when it comes to research, but also strengthen institutions such that they put in structures in place as they provide care to be able to carry out research at the end of the day. Then patient awareness and understanding of research. You find that many patients do not understand why they have to have extra time in the hospital to answer questions or to do extra tests or to have more tests than others. So just creating that awareness amongst patients that it is good to participate in research and that the research has a benefit for them. And then also to understand for patients that sometimes they might have access to drugs that they would otherwise not be able to afford, and this would be of benefit to them. The lengthy regulatory processes when we're looking at approvals through the ethics and research boards. So it's sometimes, I'd say in Kenya, it can take upwards of 90 days to be able to get your approvals done. And many times you find that they come back with questions or clarifications that could lengthen the process even further. More so if you're looking at doing research in vulnerable populations, it could take a while, and this would pose a challenge to pharma if they're coming in and they find that this process might be too long or sometimes even a little bit more expensive than in a different country. Sorry, I was muted for a minute there. Then you find that you may need to we may need to have meetings with our ethics boards to see how we can make this process a friendly process so that we can be able to carry out research. And the competitive disadvantage in attracting funding, we find that as much as non-communicable diseases still pose a challenge, we still have communicable diseases being the burden, causing the burden of deaths within sub-Saharan Africa. I think COVID taught us a lot when it comes to communicable diseases and our unpreparedness for that. And I think a lot more funding will be going into communicable diseases as well. But we still struggle in the cancer space to be able to attract funding in Africa. And then currently the global financial crisis leading to low funding opportunities. We do not have funds dedicated for research in most places, and we rely on collaborations or funding from either Pharma or outside Western countries to be able to carry out research. So it can pose a challenge if there's a global financial crisis, as we are seeing now, to be able to carry out good research that will give us data that can be adapted all over. So those are some of the threats that we see, but it doesn't mean that the situation is bleak. We can do certain things to improve the infrastructure within the national clinical research networks, and also support collaboration between healthcare institutions, looking for multi-center studies to be done, and that way cutting down costs, but also increasing the pool of patients that you can be able to get, improving the learning space in terms of research and research knowledge, and also pulling in pharma and showing them that there is benefit in doing clinical research within the African space, so that we can be able to see the changes that are unique to Africa in terms, especially in terms of genetics, and the cases that we see are also very different from the case. Many of our cases are also a little bit more advanced. Then improving our registries so that we can be able to understand, the cases that we see more commonly, the disease burden that we have, and also how we can be able to improve on the clinical research in those areas. What you find is that most registries within sub-Saharan Africa are not comprehensive registries. They are probably population, institution, or not very good population-based registries. And we're not able to get a good picture of what the actual burden is in terms of cancer cases within the region. And then diversify methods of patient engagement. So utilizing patient advisory groups to show that enrolling in a research program is a good idea, or giving data when called upon is a good idea, so that we can be able to build on that knowledge and be able to see how best we can engage with pharma to do clinical research. And then collaboration between multiple stakeholders, where we're looking at government, the different regulatory bodies, especially when it comes to the ethic boards, and then the pharma industry and the healthcare professionals. So many healthcare professionals do not know that they can engage with pharma to be able to carry out research, or that there's interest in carrying out research. I think for a long time, pharma just assumed that Africa is just a consumer of their products and might not have input into what goes into those products. So there's talks that could take place, and we can be able to do that. I think many times we need, as the healthcare professionals or as researchers, we need to show that interest and keep engaging with pharma, because they sometimes might not see the potential. They may see the potential, but they may not see the way to go about it, because they assume that it might be too expensive for them to start laying down the infrastructure to be able to carry out some of these studies. But with collaboration between institutions, the government, the regulators, we can be able to come up with ways in which we can make it friendly to carry out clinical research in the region. And then mentorship. Many of us studied without actually doing a lot of research, and the processes, especially when it comes to talking or doing, or the actual process of going through a clinical trial, if you've not been exposed to it, might seem quite daunting. But with somebody who's done it, or with centers that are actually doing it, to hold the hands of upcoming researchers to be able to do this, we'll be able to increase our productivity and publications, and also our grant success when we're looking for funding to be able to carry out some the clinical research that we're talking about. And I think these trainings are a good way to get that interest started, and a good way to link up and collaborate amongst ourselves and look for mentors as well. So in conclusion, as we aim to improve affordability and value, we also want to ensure that we have adequate incentives to promote investment in research, to promote the development for different oncological treatments, also looking at the population in Africa. And it's a tricky balance to try and get pharma on board to give us that opportunity, but it is something that is very doable. With the Pan-African Clinical Trials Registry, you can be able to get a snapshot of some of the research that is going on within Africa. And this can help us see ways in which we can start looking at different questions that we can look at for starting to answer research questions in Africa, and also to see that it's not impossible to have clinical trials done in Africa, that they are happening. There's no reason why Egypt and South Africa should be having 71% of the trials run. The other countries should also try and step up, and we should try and see how we can link up and work together to be able to improve clinical research. So the situation is not bleak, it's not dire. I think there are opportunities available, but it's a process in which we have to work together, a lot of collaboration and a lot of mentorship as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Helena Musao, for that wonderful presentation. You hit a lot of points Now, this is the time for a question and answer session. Do we have anyone with a quick question? I can start. Dr. Musao, what do you think would require for your institution, for instance, to give you protected time to be able to do some of these clinical trials? What would the institution want? Because it's a public center, and we have so many public centers that you already have huge patient loads, and the patients are already there. So what would they need? And the second question is, what do you think would be the role of the government, for instance, the Ministry of Health, the government of Kenya, in trying to promote, uptake of clinical trials in general?
So thank you very much, Dr. Chite. For your first question, what would the institution that I work in need? I believe the institution is already working on looking to do clinical trials. So they're trying to set up the facility to be able to, in future, run clinical trials. They would need a lot of, I'd say, capacity building, because the structures in place, just and probably some benchmarking to see what is actually required. In the public institutions, I don't think there's too many that have run clinical trials, especially for oncology drugs. A lot of them have worked with the expanded access programs, or have worked with or have collaborated with other centers. But to start off a clinical trial on their own, they haven't done that. So probably mentorship as well, to be able to see what would happen. I think in terms of the government or the national, in terms of the healthcare system, we have a very unique situation in Kenya where we may not always have unique identifiers. So each institution might have its own unique identifier. So just laying some of those systems in place nationwide, such that if a patient moves from facility X to Y, we can be able to access that data to inform on the patient's journey for their treatments. Improving on the social insurance such that we can reduce out-of-pocket costs for patients, because we know once clinical trials come into place, there's additional tests that come in. Sometimes it could be blood tests, maybe tumor markers. Other times it could be imaging at the end of the day. So just if there's insurance to be able to cater for that, if the trial itself is not able to cater for that, then nationally that would be beneficial, because that would ensure that there's improved uptake of patients enrolling onto the trials. And then what else would the government do? I mean, there's a lot the government can do in terms of trying to attract, reducing the waiting time for, or fast tracking sometimes even the approvals for some of these drugs to be used within the country, because that can pose a challenge if you want to run a trial but the drug is not going to be you have regulations that might not be able to be approved on time for the study timeline that you have. So those are some of the things I can think of right now, just at the top of my head.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Musao. And from the chat box, we have Mohammed Jallo, who actually concurs with you and thanks you for reviewing the major challenges that we face in doing research, which are shared across the region. So allow me at this time, and for those who have just joined and those who've been with us, please use the chat box, as well as you can write your questions down. We'll have some breakout sessions where you can raise some of these things so that we can have some robust discussions. Feel free to use the chat box as well as raise your hand. I can see Ian Tanok, your hand is up. Please, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Musao, for that very nice summary. I just wanted to point out to the people on the line the opportunities for training at the clinical methods workshops. These are sponsored by ASCO, ACR, URTC, ESMO, and various organizations. And they allow young people, young oncologists, to go to a week-long course and take an idea and give general training in how to do a clinical trial, and also convert an idea into a protocol. And about half of those end up being done. One of our former speakers, Dorothy Lomack, who actually went she's from Lusaka, she actually went to one of these workshops held in India, the Credo workshop. I'm actually wearing the shirt with the Credo workshop because I teach there. But these courses are held, well, apart from COVID times, every year in the United States, in Europe, and in India, and every other year in Australia and the South Pacific. And they do provide that type of training, and they also provide funding to allow people to come from lower and middle income countries. So I would strongly encourage people who wish to get that training in research to apply for one of these courses.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ian, for that input. And so I think we shall cross to the next speaker and allow us, we can share the slide, please, Vanessa. Allow us to introduce the next speaker, who is Dr. Shalini Mohani. Dr. Shalini is the Executive Medical Director, Health Equity and Inclusive Research at Genentech in the US Medical Affairs. Dr. Mohani has been the medical leader for tocilizumab for multiple other immunological indications, including the treatment of COVID-19 pneumonia because of its anti-inflammatory properties. She conducted the largest randomized placebo-controlled trial for COVID-19 pneumonia in a diverse population enriched for underserved minority patients. This trial has become foundational for the Genentech's mission to be a leader in the health equity research. Please allow me to welcome Dr. Shalini Mohani. Please, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Can I have the next slide, please? Two more, I think. Oh, this is perfect. So thank you all for the opportunity to spend time today sharing an industry perspective on inclusive research and how it can help advance equitable access to care. Clinical research is a treatment option that can provide early access to novel medicines, and there are some well-characterized disparities in clinical research. Roche Genentech believes that representation of real-world patient populations is required to improve clinical outcomes for patients, and that more representative patient populations in clinical research will help to realize the promise of personalized healthcare for all. So it's really something that is built into the way we think about clinical trials, how we conduct trials, and where. And we believe that it's a moral and scientific obligation to ensure that patients in our trials really mirror those who have the disease. Unfortunately, we are still largely enrolling patients of European descent, and 88% of genomic material that is available to scientists is of European ancestry. So we don't believe that we can advance personalized medicine if we don't include all patients. And so this is informing how we conduct future clinical trials. There are many potential barriers to clinical trial enrollment and healthcare equity as outlined on this slide and spoken to earlier. But they range from factors in a patient's environment and financial toxicity to investigators' perhaps unconscious bias when offering clinical trials to their patients, and clinical trial protocols that may be limited in their capacity to enroll a broad patient population, as well as local policies or regulations. By recognizing these potential barriers and working closely with key external stakeholders, we believe we can provide better access to clinical research for patients. Next slide, please. So there are three key stakeholders when it comes to inclusive registrational trials, and these are patients, healthcare professionals, and the pharmaceutical industry. Patients can benefit from clinical research by getting early access to novel treatments, but as spoken to earlier, may face challenges related to time and cost associated with participation in a study. Or perhaps there is an educational barrier around the rationale for why they may require additional study visits or certain assessments that are being performed. Though in our experience, we've learned that a little bit of patient education by a trusted healthcare provider can help alleviate some of those concerns. So simply taking a patient and walking them through the trial protocol or the rationale for why a certain test is performed can be very helpful in overcoming some of those barriers. And so for healthcare professionals, Dr. Musao already touched on some of the opportunities and challenges that HCPs face when incorporating clinical research into their work. But we as an industry partner really want to understand what the drivers of these barriers are, whether it's really inability to focus time on it, is it take away time from clinical practice and thus there are financial implications potentially, any potential stressors coming from the institution itself, and how we might be able to overcome this together. Whether that is providing support through study coordinators or additional training materials, working on off hours. So having the study team be flexible in accommodating clinic time. So respecting the boundaries of standard time for clinical medicine, and then using research time in those after hours, much like you all are attending this course after the workday. So one benefit from a health equity perspective is allowing healthcare providers to build professional capabilities and their careers locally without having to move away to bigger institutions. And this provides access to specialty care for patients in the community. So that's helping advance health equity or equitable access to healthcare for more patients by allowing them to have providers that have gained expertise in their field. I briefly mentioned earlier the rationale for the pharmaceutical industry in expanding clinical trial access to all patient populations, and how improving trial heterogeneity will advance personalized healthcare. Some of the challenges we're faced with center around the patient or provider environment and the ability to influence or affect these. So while we do not make capital investments in equipment or buildings for sites for trials to be able to conduct research, we do make investments in building skills and capabilities of site staff. And both of these are necessary to be able to conduct clinical research. Next slide, please. This slide highlights some examples of increasing healthcare capacity through public-private partnerships. The intent of each of these is to make healthcare more accessible to more patients. In the example of the Roche laboratory in South Africa, it increases diagnostic capabilities by providing training courses to local lab technologists, thereby increasing the amount of patients that can access diagnostic testing. This translates to better health equity for health outcomes, as more patients can be diagnosed accurately and thus receive appropriate and timely therapy. The sponsorship of mobile clinic trains addresses an environmental barrier by providing access to healthcare in rural areas for patients who would otherwise be unlikely to receive care. And training scholarships provided in partnership with the Kenyan government increase the number of healthcare professionals that serve oncology patients, translating to more patients who will have access to timely diagnosis and management. As you can see from these examples, there are many ways that industry can partner with key external stakeholders to positively impact the healthcare system in a sustainable and meaningful way. Next slide, please. I'd like to supplement what is shared by other speakers in this session with some information on how you might or may engage with pharmaceutical industry partners. The key to any partnership is understanding individual interests and capabilities and identifying areas of overlap. And there are many ways to learn about available clinical trials and sites, including online resources, through a clinical research organization or CRO, or directly through pharma companies. When first starting out, it's important to be patient with the process. So industry is governed by many policies and regulations that must be followed to maintain compliance. In addition to sponsored trials, where you may serve as an investigator, there are other opportunities to conduct clinical research in collaboration with pharma, such as investigator-initiated studies. These are typically smaller trials that are fully designed and executed by an external investigator with some support from pharma, whether that's in the form of provision of the medicine, the investigational drug, or some other in collaboration with other funding sources. You may use pharma support. There are also examples of research collaborations to do retrospective studies based on health record data. And this can result in hypothesis generation and publications and possibly design of future studies. I want to take this time to highlight some common biases that are also really misperceptions. In reality, conducting trials in low and middle income countries is often not different from some parts of well-developed countries such as the US. Though through clinical trial experience, we have learned that environmental issues that patients and providers face and the limited availability of equipment are actually present everywhere, regardless of which country we are in. And I have firsthand experience to attest that trials run in low and middle income countries can be conducted quickly with scientific rigor and not at increased expense necessarily. The key is really in working closely together to define the barriers up front, the limitations, and then while maintaining focus on those opportunities that clinical trials provide for patients, the healthcare system, and medicine. Next slide, please. Roche Genentech has a global footprint with colleagues based in many parts of the world, including major regions of the African continent. And we currently are conducting early and late stage clinical trials in the countries highlighted on this slide. The intention behind these efforts is really first and foremost to reach more patients to provide more equitable access to clinical research and care, while increasing also representation of diverse genomic data to ensure that all patients can realize the benefits of personalized medicine. We look forward to continuing to build capabilities among our partners in these countries and to expand our footprint with time. Next slide, please. So thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions you have at this time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shalini Mohani, for that wonderful presentation. There's already a question here, actually a couple of questions. So one question is, how does pharma companies manage the issue of market and research? Most pharma consider that their market is small in sub-Saharan Africa, which can limit the research to include Africa within their portfolio. So how do you marry this from a pharma standpoint?
Yes, I think it's a fair question to consider potential business considerations around the opportunity to conduct clinical research within a country. However, I think our view regarding the rationale for conducting clinical research and expanding our clinical trial footprint is really based on the heterogeneity of patients that exist in many countries now as we become more of a global society. So this realization that it's not about a single country or a single market, but rather the impact that that data could potentially have on patients everywhere. We are working with local regulatory groups and within our own processes and structure to try to alleviate any of those types of concerns around whether or not no decisions are made based on purely from a market standpoint when we're looking at clinical research. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you so much. And then there are a couple of questions here, but I think they were sent for the previous presenter. And perhaps we can discuss during the breakout session, but just to alert all of you to these questions, they said, it's very true that clinicians in Africa do not really have enough time for research because of the workload. So how do we address this challenge? I think this would be a nice discussion in one of the groups. And then secondly, they say cancer patients in our setting, usually they have late stage at diagnosis because of inadequate or shortage of diagnosis tools. What is your long-term strategic plan to address these benefits to the patient? So I think this can be taken during our breakout sessions, and it covers several people. I have one quick question for Shalini. One of the areas is looking at how are you thinking about improving capacity building for regulatory bodies for trials, just because we've noticed sometimes I would ask, why is it taking 3 or 4 months for some of the regulatory bodies to give us research certificates for some of our studies after we already have ethical approval? And one of the reasons was that they are not really very clear on oncology clinical trials. They are so used to malaria, HIV, and the infectious trials. So how can we partner, or how can Pharma assist in this area in terms of capacity building for regulatory bodies in sub-Saharan Africa?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I'm the best person to speak to that information. I have many regulatory colleagues that can probably bring more knowledge to that question or to this response. However, I think there is opportunity to raise this as an issue, and for perhaps pharma companies to consider bridging that network between health authorities. So health authorities in the US and Europe who are familiar with reviewing these trials may be able to lend some peer-to-peer knowledge to health authorities in other countries who may be less familiar with trial protocols or designs. So at least there is some level of familiarity that can be brought to the situation. And then also to provide some rationale for the need to review rapidly, because the opportunity for clinical research, especially in oncology indications, means that it will bring new therapies quickly to patients who are currently in need of them.
Yeah, thank you so much. And for those who have additional questions, please use the chat box underneath your screen to ask your questions. And also, please feel free to raise them and let it be as interactive as possible, especially during the breakout sessions as well. So allow me to move on to the third speaker and presenter for the evening. And it's a great honor to introduce you to Dr. Funmi Olopade. And Dr. Funmi Olopade is a Walter L. Palmer Distinguished Service Professor of Medicine and Human Genetics, and is the founding director of the Center for Clinical Cancer Genetics and Global Health at the University of Chicago Medical Center. Dr. Olopade's research is focused on gaining a better understanding of the etiology and genomic basis of cancer progression in diverse populations. She has published extensively on genetic and non-genetic risk factors for breast cancer, and is internationally renowned for discoveries in cancer genetics and clinical expertise in cancer risk assessment and management of breast cancer in young women. It's my greatest pleasure to invite Dr. Olopade. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to join you all this late hour, for those of you who are in Kenya and all over the globe. I really thought that what I would do to follow the really interesting 2 talks by the previous speakers is to now take you home to my experience working with Pharma, because I don't think we can do anything without having Pharma firmly in place to help us. And then the question is, how do we avoid the bias? That's the topic I was asked to do. But I thought that perhaps what I should really focus on is, how do you actually get an investigator-initiated clinical trial done? Ian, thank you for thinking of me, or whoever thought of me. Maybe it's BVGH. But I also know that ASCO, and anyone that knows me knows that I've been really talking about equity and about inclusion in research for a very long time because I practice on the south side of Chicago. And leaving Nigeria to get to America and to find the deplorable condition of Black people in America was not only a shock to me, was actually a disappointment given all of the work that we had done to try and root apartheid out of Africa. So the work is not done, it's actually only just beginning. And I know that after this pandemic, and we were just having a discussion earlier on about how racism in biomedical research, colonialism, call it whatever you want to call it, is really, it really hindered what we could have done together in solidarity. And I'm hoping that the whole clinical trials infrastructure gets completely disrupted, just like COVID has disrupted us. And then we can all come back together in solidarity, as Shalini has talked about, to do the right studies. Because we're not going to get to precision oncology until we know that we're one human race. And because the genome of all of us came out of Africa, there's no difference between any races. There's just one human race. For us geneticists, the only difference is that we have variants and we have different ways that our genes are regulated that may differ from one person to the other. And so everyone is unique. That's why you can have your fingerprint, and that fingerprint is unique to you. So what are the fingerprints of everybody's tumor, or the fingerprint of every person's toxicity to therapy? What are the fingerprints of all of the things that actually would be important in thinking about our response to therapy? And that's why I think, you know, the pharmaceutical industry is spending billions of dollars to get a drug to market as a pure waste of money, because we haven't done the fundamental thing to actually really make sure that we're all included in the studies. So this paper, I like to use it because it actually came out at the same time as we were having Black Lives Matter protests, and we were having unrest and looting in Chicago, and the whole place was upside down this time last year. My students couldn't go to classes and they were all out on the streets of Chicago, and really talking about a time now to have solidarity. I'm a breast cancer researcher, and so I've really traveled the world talking about breast cancer. But this paper talked about majority of Black women in the US, and of course, every colonizing country names an island their own. So the British and French Caribbean, there's the Dutch Caribbean. But the thing is that because of the slave trade, a lot of Africans were taken out of Africa, and then some became liberated and settled in Bahia in South America. Some of them found their way back, and this is why the Lagos, where I grew up in Nigeria, is called Lagos, because some of the returning slaves from Brazil settled in Lagos, and we have Brazilian quarters in Lagos. And you know that if you follow anthropology and you follow the slave route, you're going to find what geneticists now call different levels of admixture as you go out of Africa into the Latin America, and then into Southern United States, where segregation and Jim Crow South actually make a lot of Southern United States individuals to almost have 100% African ancestry. So when we begin to talk about genetics, we get into a lot of debates about Black, white, who is Black, who is white. And there's some countries like in Brazil that don't even want us to talk about Black, white, because they see a lot of admixture. And there's some countries where you're not even going to find any more remnants of Black people who landed in South Africa, because either from disease or from maltreatment, there's hardly any admixture there. And then you have, of course, the indigenous people who also had a significant admixture, especially when you begin to talk about Mexico and Hispanic populations in the US. So the market is huge for populations of African ancestry. So to say, Chite, that there's no market and that's why pharma is not coming to Africa is actually not true, right? What is the truth is that we have not really developed or allowed certain populations to be able to participate in the full complement of biomedical research. And I think everybody has come to accept that. So now what do? We know that there's been a lot of violence on Black and Brown people. And because of that, it's actually shaped what we call Black or white in research. And Shalini would, and anyone who does global oncology or global cancer research would realize that there are more Black people on the Indian continent than you would even imagine, because Black is a skin tone, whereas when you start having a social construct to define who is Black or white, no Indian in America will ever say they're Black, but some of them are darker than I am. So that's why sometimes when we begin to talk about diversity and whether it's racial, ethnic diversity, people get very confused about what it is that we're talking about. And but I don't think we're going to get to precision oncology until we begin to understand what this all means. And the reason why this is important is that I really always practiced medical oncology on the south side of Chicago. The south side of Chicago is the most segregated of all cities because Black people are just on the south side of Chicago. So our catchment area in our cancer center is almost 80% Black. And then I have one of the foremost universities in cancer research in that same area. So people will come to us from all over the place looking to participate in oncology clinical trials. And unlike my colleagues in predominantly white neighborhoods, when we ask our patients if they want to participate in clinical trials, the answer is always yes. And we have one of the highest accrual to oncology clinical trials from the University of Chicago, just because we're in the neighborhood and people come to us. But one of the things that we found was, and we had been reporting on it for a very long time, was that there was excess of triple negative breast cancer. And I remember when I tried to publish this paper in JCO with just about 300 patients, the editors rejected the paper because they did not accept that it was possible that we had predominantly ER negative breast cancer, and we had to do more experiment. And by doing more experiment, we found out that, in fact, if we use the biomarkers that were used to categorize Lumina A, Lumina B, HER2 positive, basal-like, we had a lot of unclassified breast cancers, the more African ancestry you had. And so immediately from 2009, we had been thinking there must be more to breast cancer than ER, PR, and HER2, where we sort of subsetted everybody to this category, and we developed clinical trials just based on what Pharma wanted, more and more escalation of drugs for people who are not responding. So we did this survey, and of course, everybody knows that Africa has the youngest population. That's why Pharma has to go there, because Africa is the only continent that's growing. Even America now is having negative growth, China, everywhere. So the question then is, how do we prepare for this growth that's going to happen in the future? So I want to share a little bit of what happens when you actually treat patients in a single institution. And this is where, when I talk about investigator-initiated clinical trial, it's important. Get data, think about the biomarker you want to use, and then think about how you move that into the clinic. So because as I said, we see a lot of Black and white in our clinic. So we developed what we call the Chicago Multi-Ethnic Breast Cancer Cohort. I would consent every patient who walked into the clinic and had breast cancer into my research. And at the end of the day, we have more than 3,500 invasive non-metastatic breast cancer in my cohort. About 595 of them received neoadjuvant chemotherapy, 51% white, 40% Black. So it really enriched for Black patients, and the median follow-up time of 6.9 years. So we know what happened to this patient. And you can see from point A, white patients were doing a lot better than our Black patients. However, if we look at the subset that did get neoadjuvant therapy and they had a complete pathologic response, you can see that we didn't see the big difference between Black and white. What we saw was people who had a past CR versus those who didn't. So this was instructive for us in thinking about, so what kinds of questions should we be asking, especially now that we know that one of the reasons, and if you're doing drug development and you really want to find mechanisms of resistance, you're going to look for those patients who did not respond to therapy. So that's why we started really thinking, if we're going to do a clinical trial in Africa, we have to think about neoadjuvant therapy. We have to take those big cancers and we have to see what happens to them. So I'm not going to go on and talk about neoadjuvant therapy, but now I think when I actually wrote an editorial and I said to JCO, every Black patient should be treated in the neoadjuvant setting because this is going to make a difference. And they said, we don't have that data. You can't just write an editorial. But I was writing it because of the pattern of responses that I was seeing in my clinic. So we then decided, okay, let's go and do a clinical trial in Nigeria. And Dr. Arowolo, he's since deceased, really helped us develop the first clinical trial that we did in Nigeria. And we were thinking, why is everybody given anthracycline-based regimen when there's all these comorbidities and Black women, before you know it, have low ejection fraction and they go into cardiac failure? Why don't we see if we can use a simple drug? Capecitabine at that time was a novel drug. It had not been approved. It was being developed. And I thought, well, this might be, if it works just as well as CMF, why don't I take capecitabine to Africa? It may solve all of our infrastructure problem because I can just give these women a pill if they have triple negative breast cancer, and lo and behold, we're done. Okay, little did I know that we're not going to be done, because what happened was that we designed the study. We started accruing patients in 2007. And then by 2010, we had accrued 16 patients who were non-metastatic. So you can imagine when you're screening patients and you're looking for Africans with non-metastatic breast cancer, and in 3 years, you could only find 16. So we stopped the therapy. But guess what happened with oral single agent Zoloda? We had 5 patients who had a path CR, 8 had simple, no response, and 3 had progressive disease. And what did we do with the study? We did radiologic assessment by ultrasonography. And 2 years ago, I was talking to my colleagues, and they still have some of those patients who got past CR with Zoloda alive and well because they were able to participate in this clinical trial. Without this clinical trial, I'm sure those women would have died of triple negative breast cancer. So these are examples. And what did we learn from that study? We saw that there was high screen failure because we came from America and we said, we are only going to treat women with non-metastatic disease. And the physicians there said, well, majority of our patients have metastasis, so it's going to be hard to approve. Why didn't you bring a study for metastatic patients for us? but we learned something there. It actually led to the approval of Xoloda in Nigeria. We took our investigators through the approval process, and guess what? Roche capitalized on it, and I'm sure they're making a lot of money on Xoloda now. But it was a partnership that started because Breast Cancer Research Foundation introduced me to Ute Digan, and this Ute was working at that time to help us get this study going. And we built the infrastructure. So fast forward, we realized that we can't really do this work without doing some fundamental discovery science. And so we started really developing the infrastructure to do genomic studies. And while we were doing that study, Roche Diagnostics was also going, and I know I would meet them at meetings telling everybody, do immunohistochemistry so you can understand, the biomarker in your patients. But we have now done exome sequencing, we've done genome sequencing, and we are able to actually look at the proportion of Nigerians who have HER2 enriched breast cancer and triple negative breast cancer compared to Black in the TCGA and Black in SEER, white, and white in SEER. So by really doing this study, you can do comparative analysis across different populations, because we know what majority of our drug trials have been targeting have been this white population here that is overly Lumina A or with ER positive breast cancer. And then you've had underrepresentation or understudied triple negative and HER2 enriched breast cancers. So to not prolong the evening, I think what I learned from doing this work was that, boy, if I took a study to Africa without engaging Africans, I was going to not get it right. So then we started planning a second clinical trial. And that second clinical trial was made possible because we had a collaboration with Novartis. And just like, because I've been here long enough, I went to my friend at Novartis Institute for Biomedical Research. And I said, why don't you give me $1 million and help me train Africans to actually help us do genomic studies? And Barbara Weber, who was a friend of mine, said, okay, Fumi, we'll give you 3 years to recruit X number of patients, show us that you can do genomic studies, and then we'll help you build infrastructure to do translational research in 2 institutions. And they did. They helped us get every equipment that we needed into 2 labs in Lagos and in Ibadan. And then we were ready to do biomarker-informed clinical trial. Then the next thing is, who's going to give us the drug? Because you're not going to be able to do a biomarker-informed clinical trial unless Pharma gives you drug. So that's where we now had to go back to Roche. And of course, before building the infrastructure, could you not see my screen? Hello?
We can see it. We can see your screen.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Right. Sorry. I thought somebody. So until so they sent, of course, for you to do a clinical trial, your site has to be pre-certified. There are no principal investigators that can serve as a PI for a study in Africa. So I have to be the PI, I have to be the sponsor, and I have to develop the team and also prepare the infrastructure. But I did think that it was important for University of Chicago to invest in this site in collaboration with Pharma. So we had to buy infusion pumps. We have to calibrate all the instruments used in the 4 sites, and you can see that, training the staff and making sure that study coordinators, pharmacists are ready. There were none available when we started, and then after preparing the site, we were able to actually get 4 sites to come up to standard so that they can do international studies. That's what it would take to be able to do that. And then we were able to get some young clinical oncologists to become trained so that they can write the protocol and lead the protocol as a country PI, site PI, while I remain the overall PI. So these protocols now, we started writing the protocol in 2017, and the first patient did not get on study until April last year. That's how long it took to write the protocol, to get the drug. And now we have ARETA, which is really the first biomarker-informed clinical trial that is targeting HER2 positive patients. Now, we talk about making sure there's no bias from pharma. When we had different iterations of the protocol, and of course, as soon as Herceptin Perjeta was Perjeta is now being approved. You need to, we can't go below standard of care. And then we thought, well, do we really need to escalate? What if we started asking the question about de-escalation? How many Nigerian breast cancer patients that can we treat and get away with just treating them with Herceptin, subcutaneous Herceptin, without escalating? And so we started off really powering this study to be able to de-escalate by finding the minimal amount of HER2 targeted therapy that we need to use, together with some chemotherapy for the synergy that would allow these women to have path CR. And then, of course, evaluate the cardiac toxicity in the study. And this study is now enrolling. In 1 year, we've enrolled 25 patients during the pandemic, because we previously saw that the population had a large number of young women with HER2 positive breast cancer. We spent the 3 years before the study socializing everybody, and it's very simple. We're going to use ultrasound echo, do the core biopsies, and then make sure that the women are histologically confirmed, give docetaxel with a subcutaneous trastuzumab, very simple, and then see whether we can get any complete responses. And if they have complete response radiologically, then we can de-escalate and just give them trastuzumab. Or if they have partial response and they need more, then we give FEC with trastuzumab, all the time measuring their ejection fraction. And of the patients who actually saw their tumors melting, some of them asked us, why should we go to surgery? And so some of them said, no, we don't want to have mastectomy. We're just going to, we've had to really think about how do we customize our study to the needs of the patients and be able to monitor them serially. So this is really proof of concept that if ASCO and if Pharma really want to do studies in Africa, they can invest, and by investing, we can build a robust clinical trials infrastructure that will benefit all of us, because this study will teach us what is the absolute minimum we need to treat patients in Nigeria. So this is the enrollment to date, and Dr. Ointekim is a site PI. We have 6 patients now who have completed the protocol and are just now they have finished their 1 year of Herceptin. 10 patients are getting radiation. And when it comes to severe adverse reactions, none. Even during the pandemic, these patients were, they transported them to the hospital. They got the best care. Only one patient has had reduction in their left ventricular ejection fraction. And then 2 participants refused surgery, but continue on Herceptin for cardiotoxicity evaluation. And then we had 1 dropout after first course of treatment for personal reasons. We are constantly fighting with religious pastors and imams in terms of whether these patients will go on study or not. But we figured out a way to address the social determinants and to provide more support for them. So let me end by saying, we really are at the point now where we shouldn't really accept only phase 4 studies or accept compassionate use. And I hope that those of you who are taking this course will really begin to understand that you can't do this by yourself. Yes, I'm a clinician, I'm incredibly busy, but I have a team. And so we have to build the team together and then really begin to socialize both the patient and the clinical trial community, and then more effectively, I think we now have genomics countries. We know companies in Africa. We know Roche Diagnostic can do genomic assays, and we can get the right drug to the right patient. And I think if we begin to really develop the evidence, maybe we can get these countries to invest in access to health insurance so our cancer patients can get care. So this is really was not going to be possible if it wasn't for Vinona, who was one of the trainees that I met and was working for Genentech, and she made it Roche, and then made it possible to link up with Edith Perez, Patricia Cortázar, because I shamed Genentech, but then they said, we don't do global studies. So they handed me over to Roche, and then Stan became my good friend because I took him to Nigeria. And after drinking beer in Nigeria, it was like, I know you have to be part of this global oncology community. And then Phil Schlatter, I mean, all these people who are really key, because without their interest and without them pushing for me, we would never have been able to do this study. And of course, we got funding from Breast Cancer Research Foundation. Dr. Ntekim got his K43, and thanks to Jennifer, she wrote a letter that we can really do this. And these are all the investigators from the foresight when we launched the study. And we meet every week and they learn how to do research. And of course, my team in Chicago doing the translational work. So I think this is possible, and it's possible only when we work together and in solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lopade, for that wonderful presentation. It just shows how much can be done, and there's so much even in sub-Saharan Africa that we can do. Mohammed has a question here that says, thank you, Dr. Fumi, for your efforts to give back to Africa. I think we should develop more North-South collaboration, knowledge, technology transfer, and perhaps funding. You may mention something to do with the funding to assist. And the second question I may ask you is, how do you, blow up this to the other sites in sub-Saharan Africa so that they can be clinical trial ready? You've seen all the work that you've done in Nigeria in those centers that are participating to ensure that there is capacity building, there is infrastructure and all that, so that they are ready to be able to do some of these studies. What are some of your thoughts around this?
Yeah, well, you know, my chair, Dr. Everett Vokes, is now the president of ASCO, and Ian, who is an amazing leader at ASCO. We had a train the trainer model when we wanted to start disseminating genetic testing in 1997. And that's when I started working with ASCO. And when ASCO puts its mind on something, it gets done, right? And so I'm hoping that I can cajole Ian and all my friends now to say that we have to do studies in solidarity, because I can't do it by myself. Now I need to train the trainer. And once somebody is trained, then they can train other people. You've trained in America, so you know oncology. I have so many young medical oncologists. In fact, our radiation oncologists, they work in different universities at the university in the US, but every week they do the radiation oncology training so that patients on our study can be adequately simulated, so that after getting HER2 targeted therapy, they're not just going to get zapped with radiation when they don't know proper planning. So it takes, and I'm saying this, that it takes all of us in the diaspora, in the North, helping the South, and then when we all work together, we can lift the boats really for all. And that's what it would take. It would not take one institution or one investigator doing this by themselves.
Thank you so much for that response. So Ian, Marcus, Vanessa, you're all on the spot on this one. And then I think there is a last one here before we go into breakout sessions. Thank you for highlighting the importance of equity in cancer care. What about palliative care research? majority of our patients are in advanced stages, and tools and guidelines available are from abroad. We need to do a lot of research to provide local evidence that will help in developing guidelines and protocols about palliative care, given the social, cultural aspects and resources we have here. I think that is very, very important. And I think we'll leave at this as we break into our groups. Vanessa, I'll hand over back to you.
Yeah,
so
let me just say something though about palliative care. I think that everyone always says we have to choose one or the other. Is it palliative care or is it experimental therapy? And I started as a medical oncologist 30 years ago when I joined the faculty at the University of Chicago. And until people in communities see survivors, we're still going to continue to talk about death from cancer and cancer being a death sentence. When I went to the communities on the south side of Chicago and I asked them, what do you think about breast cancer? And they think that cancer is a death sentence. They don't want to deal with it. They don't want it. They don't want to even think about it. But now, you know who helps us recruit? The breast cancer survivors. So that's why we have to treat patients with curative intent and then get more survivors to help us. And then all this nonsense about treat what you can do and palliate what you can do is being the racist policies that got us to where poor people are trapped where they are and then nobody cares about them. So I don't believe that the HIV epidemic would not have been taken into Africa in terms of the treatment if the AIDS community accepted that just do palliative care in Africa, right? Now we're talking about eliminating HIV/AIDS. And I think the cancer community, the oncology community can no longer accept, yes, let's do palliative care in Africa. Let's do awareness in Africa, and then we are not going to treat patients with early cancer. Totally unacceptable. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I totally concur with you on this response, and especially when we have the patient support groups, our breast cancer support groups, where you even have some patients 4 or 5 years ago who are diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer that are still alive, and they continue being part of these support groups. You can actually see the kind of energy they go in when they're discussing about cancer care. So I totally agree with you. We should always look at ways of treating with curative intent and being as aggressive, working closely with the patient, of course, by being as aggressive as we can be in treatment. I think I'll hand over this to